So I think a couple of you came to the first version of this when we did this a couple of weeks ago. And so we decided to offer a second round of the first session as an opportunity for those of you who came the first time to maybe share a bit about what you took from the first go at this, but also to make this available to people who lived in non-American centric time zones. So make it much more convenient for you to participate. And really the purpose for these is to offer a series of discussions about the five maturities that we launched in May, and we've had an extraordinary response to the report, but also to these early conversations. And part of the value of these conversations for us is to help us all find language for what is it that we're all looking for? What is it that we feel yearning for in our life or our practice? What do we sense maybe might be missing in terms of our own growth at this point in time? And sort of early senses of how we imagine the five maturities might help us with this. So I'm keeping the screen not shared at the moment. We've got the slides from the first time around, which we can put up in a minute. But I want to just I'm going to put you all in gallery view so I can see everybody. And just ask, how many of you came to the first session when we did this a couple of weeks ago? Great. So this is where I'd like to start. I'd like to start, like, what did you take from that that was meaningful for you as a question, as an insight, as a possibility? Kind of what was resonating for you that you might share with the others as a way to kind of orient our conversation for tonight?
Hi, David. It's Colleen. I could share.
Yes.
I think it was something that you said, and I captured it in my notes here, and it really resonated with me. And it was nourishing the roots of who we are and how we are in the world in terms of what we do.
Okay. And what was important to you about that, Colleen?
So I found myself on this own journey of transition for myself as well. So it's this I consider my year of discovery. So it's discovering more about who I am and who I want to be, who am I becoming.
Wonderful. Well, you're in the right place for that, so that's good. Anyone else care to share?
Hi, David. How are you doing?
Hey, Tracy.
I watched the recording, so I didn't go to the live session, but I'm deeply curious about this work. I have been for a while. And with the recording, one thing that really stood out to me was this question of what are we being called to attend to in a moment? This idea, both either with clients or in our professional spaces or personally, what is being asked, how are we being asked to show up in a moment, what's being asked of us, but also what are we being asked to develop in that moment in ourselves, but also the same thing when we're working with clients or in relationship with someone else, what are we being called to attend to in them and to help facilitate it in them. And I think I had never put as much emphasis in, I mean, we talk about presence in coaching and being client-centered or being present in our daily lives, but looking at the maturities as a way to have an understanding of really getting clear, or at least curious about what in that moment is of note to attend to, really stood out to me.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, David and everyone. Something that has been standing out to me is the contextual maturity. And what I'm looking at with that is it allows for an overt concept of shift or movement or flux or flow back and forth between the intensities of the other maturities, social,
Mhm.
personal, professional. And it opened for me that sometimes subject or focus on the surface can seem disparate or unrelated, and yet on deeper levels, there's a theme or an energy pattern
Mm.
that connects these things that appear different on the surface.
Mm.
So what's happening for me in exploring this with everyone is I've kind of shifted from a horizontal landscape view, and there's a vertical presence in this too now. And it feels like I'm sewing together some elements that were just like a scatter of salt in the sky, and now they're constellating. They're starting
Yeah.
to speak to each other. And I'm
Mm.
just being appreciative of how that plays out in coaching and how that plays out in my personal life.
Hmm. Yeah, I had a conversation today with one of our ID faculty members, and we were sort of one of the insights that's emerged that led to the paper was, we often think of thresholds as this horizontal crossing from one dramatic place to another, which it can be, but so many of the things that we're working on are often a to and fro, both directions across the threshold, and the threshold actually might be vertical, not just horizontal. And I think it's one of the amusing things about getting older is you keep bumping into things you swore you dealt with earlier in your life, and it comes right back again.
So
But you can, and hello, yes. And so there's this, the Mobius strip that we have in ID that between, ourselves and actions, and trying to create some language around reframing that development is not just a forward moving horizontal process. Yeah, so anyone else want to share from the first go around? Otherwise, we'll kind of dive into the slides and bring the rest of the folks up to speed with our first conversation. Oh, good.
If I
Okay.
might, David,
Yeah, Martin.
I've been thinking about the five maturities for a little while, and it's a really broad concept, and yet it's also very subtle and very nuanced, and you can drop down into it to great depth. And it's like, I've been thinking of it as a sort of, if you like, a two-dimensional picture. It's not like a picture. It's like a landscape that you're in. And whichever way you look round, there are different things to explore in different contexts. So I'm just marinating in that at the moment.
Yeah. Thinking about like traveling in the forest or in the desert, where at one level it all looks the same, but as you stand in it long enough, you start to see the nuances of the topography, and the vegetation. And I try to keep this the frame as broad as we could, so it was inclusive, and knowing full well there's going to be a lot of different variations depending on context, but also that people could find their way, and it would evolve over time. And at the same time, wasn't so broad that you kind of got lost in the weeds and couldn't find anything. And so I do feel like it allows you to kind of intuitively drop into certain things and start to notice certain features. So great. So let me just share the screen here. Oh, I was sharing the screen. Oh, well, sorry about that. I thought I was being so organized. Okay. So as we go along, it will be much easier for me because I can see you all now. Just raise your hand if you'd like to share something, or you're welcome to put it in the chat box if you like. And recognize some of you are off camera and some of you are out walking and doing what you're doing. And so we've talked, so for those of you who have showed up for the first time, I'm just really curious, what brought you here? What intrigued you, inspired you, baffled you? Um, would any of you like to share? Derek.
So admittedly, I know nothing about this model, about the five maturities. So this is kind
Okay.
of, it's really curiosity for me.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, Les.
Yeah, I heard about you through something about narrative coaching program that you had, and then ran into the five maturities. And I'm curious because I stumble across what I'm doing versus the orthodoxy of what I did in my training and trying to figure out how to get free.
Yes, I created narrative coaching for that very purpose. So this is just an extension of that in a way. Yeah, Miriam.
I'm here because of my curiosity of the work you do. Love all your work, have done all your courses, not all, but most. And maturity is a very big topic for me. I've studied adult development from different perspectives, and I'm really curious about this. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So what just to that end, Miriam, one of the distinctions I make in the paper is someone else might. I have no interest in creating a stages model, like say a Keegan type model.
Yeah.
I find that conceptually valuable and interesting, but practically not very useful for me personally. And recognizing that maturity looks different in different cultures, and I want to make it such that not only can we reimagine how we might develop or assess coaches, but that it creates access for people to begin to think more about their own maturity rather than figure out which box or stage they fit in.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Yes, that's something of great interest to me as well. So I appreciate being here. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Hey, Laura, we can see.
Morning,
Laura,
David.
we can see you now. The
You can
sun's
see
come
me
up.
now. The sun's coming up. It's getting nice. It's freezing.
Yeah.
Morning. I have been around this work for a little while, as you know, David, and but I've changed my context. So 2 times since I studied ID, and so I'm just really here to just join back in this conversation around maturity.
Okay.
And I always learn something, and I'm really trying to work through how to apply this work in my current context. I think I'm doing an okay job, but there's always more to do.
Sure. Well, welcome back.
Thank you.
Lauren was part of a group that early on helped me kind of get from the second draft to the final version. And we're in the midst of actually organizing all of the NC and ID material into creating a new learning platform. And in that, I've actually discovered a change I'm going to make in the model based on my further thinking around how you would teach this. But yeah, so it's been Lauren was very important as part of that small group. So since we just have an hour, so I want to just spend some time talking about some of the pieces here. So I'll let you read this and I'll sort of explain kind of why we're starting here. Yeah. So for me, I've been in the coaching space for 28 years now. And but I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't going to find what I needed in the more traditional path through coaching. So I used my research for my PhD to create narrative coaching, and I've continued to write quite a bit in the coaching space and doing various things in and around coaching. But I started to realize that coaching, particularly through the pandemic, just sort of exploded and became almost everything and nothing at the same time, and felt like everybody became a coach. And so I began to think about a couple of things. One is that coaching started in a very different era with to me, somewhat some brilliant foundations, but also some questionable ones. And what the world was asking now and what coaches are moving towards now is actually an opportunity to reimagine what coaching even is. And so this is part of that conversation. And what sort of emerged for me out of the paper was not only a recognition that we need to move far beyond competency models if we want to have any kind of integrity around measuring or evaluating coaching, but even more than that, and you'll see this in a slide that's coming up, particularly in our next session, which is in a couple of weeks soon, that I think it's actually calling for a whole different view of what our practice even is. And to sort of summarize that, I believe we're moving to a place where coaching will become one of the skills that we offer our clients. But our primary entry point with the client is us as a human being. And recognizing that the diversity and complexity of our clients' issues cannot be solved by any one profession, not even close anymore, outside of certain maybe basic things. And so for me, I just hear again and again and again how many people come to coaching with a very rich background, and often to feel constrained, particularly if they're trying to be accredited by some of the more traditional associations. They feel stifled, and they feel like they have to leave so much of themselves out of the room, which seems like a loss for them and for their clients. And so we want to begin to imagine how we might use the 5 maturities to help kind of move past that. And so, yes, pick your poison here. Again, this is not what we're after. Many coaches, I think, accrue too much stuff. And so it's not very helpful for us or for our clients in a way. So the 5 maturities is not one more thing to stuff into your already overcrowded pack, or more weight to put on top of your giant rock. And what we're after is this sort of image that many of you would have seen in our programs. But I'll let you read my paraphrased version of Albert Schweitzer's quote to explain why I think that's important and how the 5 maturities can help. So why one of the many ways this speaks to the 5 maturities is that the research from decades of psychotherapy research and to some degree coaching research, because it's much newer and much less researched, but the single most by far variable in terms of client outcomes are things related to the client. The second thing is a second most significant variable is the relationship the client has with us. And yet, when we assess coaches, when we think about developing coaches, we focus almost exclusively on the coach. But the coach and certainly the methodology, in some ways, have very little effect on outcomes. And so I wanted to create a framework that allowed us to do 2 things. One was to lift up the significance of the client and the relationship in terms of how we think about coaching and develop ourselves as coaching. But even more importantly, the true measure of coaching is not how many boxes the coach ticked, how happy the client was with the session, how well the coach utilized their methodology or whatever. The fundamental piece here is that what did the client actually do as a result of the session? And so then our fundamental goal in this work now is thinking about how do we need to rethink coaching such that our primary focus is not ourselves, not our work, but equipping the client to do more and be more than they could before they started. And again, that's not part of, and as far as I know, I could be missing something, it's not part of any assessment structure, really. And it's often not even part of our thinking. And so I wanted to create a way to look at this very differently. And so before we get too far, I'll take this back, so otherwise you're distracted. So I just want to check in and see if there's anything coming up for you so far, and then I'm going to talk more about maturities in particular.
Yes.
Yes, Les.
Yeah, so I got stuck on the word wounded. Okay.
Yes.
I wanted to know about what the meaning or significance of that choice of word is. And I
Yes.
think the syntax is ambiguous, whether it's we, the client, or all of us who are wounded in this statement.
It's primarily referencing the coach at this point, but it actually applies to both people. It comes from a book from many decades ago by Henry Nouwen, who was a Catholic priest. And he talked a lot about what we in my terms would think about the fierce humility of this work. That we're not coming there to rescue our clients or save our clients or fix our clients or imagine that we're perfect, and that we're actually two humans in conversation with each other. And so part of that is recognizing that humility comes from our own wounds, literally and figuratively across our life, our own journeys that we've been on, the unique character we've become. And so I find for me that framing, I don't see it as a deficit. I don't see it as a limitation. It's just really coming to this as two humans walking together.
Okay, thank you.
You're most welcome. Anything else for right now? Okay. All right, let's talk a bit about maturity. So again, you can read this for yourself, and then I'll share a few things. So for me, part of the value of maturity is that all of the masteries we're seeking in learning skills or practices or tools as a coach, our ability to use them effectively is built on our foundation of maturity. So it doesn't matter how many certifications you have or how many skills you have or how proficient you feel as a coach. If you can't be present, if you can't be astute in how you're using your skills, if you can't self-regulate. And so for me, I felt for so long, coaching's been overweighted about acquiring stuff, going back to our heavy sack and our heavy rock. And if indeed the relationship and the experience the client is having with us and what they're doing with all this is the ultimate value, then the maturity allows ourselves to notice when fear arises or anxiety arises, and notice when we disconnect from our clients, or they from us, or they from themselves. And how do we actually mature ourselves so we can hold bigger spaces for the client to do their work? How can we lovingly challenge a client? How can we become aware of our own issues that get surfaced by whatever the client is choosing to work on? And so maturity is not only the foundation for our ability and our client's ability to do the work that's necessary, it's even our ability to be in conversation and relationship with each other. And so this is sort of the simplest way to explain what I just shared, but I want to, going back to how some of you checked in, this is really about nourishing the soil so that you can mature, that you can grow at this, whatever stage of life you're in. And ultimately, our clients don't remember hardly anything we've said in coaching. They remember some of what we've done, but what they mostly remember was how it felt to be with us and how they felt when they left and what they could do as a result. And so for me, I want to use the report to balance out our obsession with skills and tools to actually figure out how do we grow ourselves so that we can be useful and present to the kinds of things that our clients are bringing to coaching at this point in time. So this is sort of putting all this together for those of you for seeing this for the first time. So in the report, that I've drawn sort of a coaching framework, which has the 5 elements. So you have the two people, the coach and the client. They're in relationship. They're bringing their skills out of that relationship to bear on the conversation. The stronger the relationship, the stronger they are as humans, the more they can use their skills well. They're engaging in a process together, conversational, dialogical process, and out of which emerges outcomes. So, originally it started out with it actually started out with competency, like recognizing that competency is only one of what it means to be a master. It's not like competent musicians have mastered all the basics of music. There's a whole bunch of other things that they develop in themselves. So then I thought, well, what else do people need to develop in order to be more masterful? So I had sort of these five frames. And then each of these maturities, all of this is present all the time, but each of these lines is connected particularly to one of the elements of coaching. And so there's five maturities, each of which supports a mastery. For those of you who are new to my work, I-Beam was the result of some research I did many years ago. It's trying to synthesize all the factors which influence performance at work. Aspiration was probably more accurately described as motivation, but that felt a bit not complete, and it didn't create as cool of an acronym. So that's why it became aspiration. I'm glad. It's funny to
Sorry,
see.
it was me laughing. I had to turn my sound on.
That's okay. Great. Good for you. So to show up fully as a human in a conversation requires us to develop ourselves. If a coach is too anxious, has too much of a need to please, doesn't like conflict, can't manage their own energy, it's going to be harder for them to be in coaching. That creates capacity. What can they actually draw on? And the example I often give is if you've never processed significant losses in your life and you have a client that shows up grieving the loss of a job or whatever, you're going to be much less equipped to deal with them because you've never really ventured into the grief space yourself. And that this capacity is a reflection of our mindset. So if I come in believing I've got to solve problems with my clients, that's one mindset. It's going to generate a different conversation than if I come in from more of a narrative mindset. In the relationship is really all about what can we see together, what can we discover together, what values are at play. And I attributed this to, originally I called it relational maturity, but I realized that wasn't enough because most people will conflate that with the actual physical relationship between two people. And those of you who've studied with me know that I see this in many other dimensions. And it's not spirituality in any shape of being religious, although that could be true for you, but it's more that can we be aware of what's happening in the relationship? So even things like attachment theory show up here. What blind spots do we have? What biases do we have? What of our own work have we not done that keeps us from seeing things about ourselves? And so the more grounded in this space we are, the clearer we are, we see things more clearly. We help our clients to see things more clearly. So an example of the value of this one would be, you have a client that comes in and complains about their manager for many, many minutes. And everything's the manager's fault, and they need to figure out how to strategize about how to fix the manager. What they're not seeing is the way in which they're complicit with their own problem. So this is where our own maturity might be used to help them start to see their picture of what their story or their picture more completely and more fully, because then there's more available to them to do something about. And this says a lot about motivations, values, etc. In terms of what's really at play here, what are we really needing to pay attention to? The one around skills, and this is one I did some more research since I put out the paper in May, and this is one I think I'm going to switch, but this is around professional maturity. It's the one that's most familiar in the coaching space. It's all around competency models. about behaviors. Again, these are all important in coaching, but I know a number of people in my life over time who know absolutely nothing about coaching, who I would go to as a coach more than I would many of the coaches I know. Because it's not because they don't have the professional specific competencies of a coaching, but they have a lot of the maturities that actually make them a more valued advisor or friend or guide for me. You'll see in a minute, but the coaching process, the thing that most coaching misses is that coaching takes place within an environment. The client comes out of an environment, they're going to return to an environment. That could be a family, a neighborhood, a company. And yet we often think of coaching as this transactional conversation between two people, separate from everything else, but it doesn't do justice to all the things the client is bringing to coaching and we must confront when they leave coaching. So this is around capabilities. Can you use your competencies in a timely, astute manner so that what you're doing matches what the person actually needs? And so then and this has a lot to do with another big realization coming out of our work in integrative development, that many of the factors that affect our clients' ability to do whatever they're trying to do are less about them specifically and much more about the environment they're in. But we don't address the environment in coaching, which means very much. And so it means that we're setting people often up for a lot of challenges in taking what they're using in coaching and applying it where they are. And so we want to, part of the advocacy in the paper is to reimagine coaching so that we're working farther upstream with our clients closer to the sources of some of their issues, but also more downstream to get to work with them in supporting what they can do in their environment when they return home. And the latter in particular is where I think technology will be very helpful.
Cauliflower. Not cauliflower rice. I didn't notice until I finished cooking it.
We need somebody to mute.
One of your bags of cauliflower rice.
If you're talking right now, could you please stop talking so I can mute everybody so we're not hearing about dinner or whatever? Yeah, thanks. So the last one is around outcomes. And so the contextual maturity, which someone brought up earlier, really is around in a moment in time. Can we look at the alchemy of all the things that are emerging in the conversation and kind of really get a sense for what's the crux of this issue? What do I understand, or what do we understand about what's happening and what needs to be done here? And the more that we can do this in real time, the more credible we become for two reasons. One is we're more able to articulate what's happening. So if I were to ask you after a conversation, what would you tell me about your coaching session? But it also means you're more likely to understand the dynamics of what's actually happening, such you're more likely to get better outcomes. And so what we know about people that are masters or highly mature professionals is that what they do and who they are become almost inseparable. What they do is who they are. And so for me now, at this stage, trying to deconstruct narrative coaching to teach it, which I've done for a long time now, it's gotten easier, but in the beginning it was so hard because it was just who I was and what I observed about a certain caliber of coaches. All right, so I'm gonna, I think that, let's see, what's next here. Yeah, oh yeah. So I'm gonna, before we go into this next piece, I'm just gonna go and see if there's any questions. I'm gonna take this down for a second and see now that we've, there's in the slide deck, which you'll see sort of descriptions of the maturities. But for now, I'm just going to take this down and just see if there's anything that's coming up for you so far that you'd like to ask before we talk a bit about how one uses all of this. And welcome to the people that just joined us. Chris.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate so much as the model lays it out that this addresses us first as coaches and how we're entering these spaces. I'd like to ask what you're seeing as we turn this to the clients and how they're entering the spaces. because I've said a number of times here, I'm living in this gap. And I think the universe has been conspiring where I'm trying to enter that space, and more of my clients are coming in not on that page at all, or very entry stages, phases, readiness for these things. So could you say a bit about how this works as a framework for the client?
Yeah. So again, one of the things I've learned over and realized over these recent years is that really the only value, the most of the value of coaching is dependent mostly on what the client is ready for. And we get excited about all kinds of things, but they may not match what the client's ready for at all. And so one of the ways that I've kind of gotten around some of this, particularly with clients that may be more linear or more expecting a more traditional coaching approach, is I've just tried to narrow the scope of what we actually try to achieve in a session. Clients often have way too many things they want to address. They don't understand most of them or many of them, and they're often interrelated. And so I just try to really narrow the lane in which we're driving. And that in itself kind of focuses them and gets them to something that's more manageable for them, so it's not so overwhelming. But the way I language this for them is like one of the downsides of, say, a more traditional, purely goal-oriented approach is it talks about future behaviors. But you're asking the person as they are now to describe a destination and a path from a place they've never been. Because otherwise they would have already achieved the goal. So I'm less interested in what they think and see now. I'm much more interested in what they discover along the way. So I try to accept the goal if that's what they've presented, like this is what I'm aspiring to go do, but then bring it much closer to home about where would you begin and what does it look like, and really stay much more in the present moment. And in that, help them to realize that if they're only going for extrinsic factors or external rewards, it's like building a house on a sand dune. It does not matter how brilliant the house is or how majestic the goal is. It's going to fall down because there's no foundation. And so I try to sort of walk with them to say everything you're trying to achieve has to have a emotional foundation under it to enable you to be able to have the support you need to actually achieve what you want. There's no point in getting too far ahead of yourself. And in the course of creating that emotional architecture, you will change yourself. You will become a person for whom that behavior becomes a natural extension of now how you now see yourself. And so explaining that way, I think, helps our more obsessed clients that way kind of pull back a bit and keep this more manageable for them. And if we do that in a session with them, they can find satisfaction because they think, oh, I could go do that, right? Because that's doable for me. And then you have them come back. So what did you notice about doing that? And what do you notice about who you're becoming as somebody who can do those things? And what would you like to do next? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Chris. Mila.
Following on that, for myself, for my own philosophy, I tend to lean hard into David Allen's GTD kind of altitudes of is it important or problematic for clients to have a sense of where they are among the altitudes on, taking it to the street and like, where can you walk this in your life versus how does that play up and down in your philosophy that around the tree of, what does this mean to your purpose? What does this mean to your projects? How does this ripple through your life?
So part of it just depends on my read of the person about kind of what kind of thinker they are, like where do they want to begin? Do they tend to begin in the details and move to the big picture, or do they start in the big picture and move to details? But I try to, whatever they've chosen to work on in this session, I try to make sure they've got the scaffolding to support them to take that out on their own. So again, some clients have huge appetites and they have huge readiness. They can take big pieces out. They can take a whole like subflooring out and put it in place because they're ready for that. Other clients, you might say, this is a piece of wood, or this is a 2x4. That's all they're ready for. Like, oh my God, I didn't realize I was completely missing the sink in the kitchen, or, whatever you want to take the analogy for. And recognizing that, again, so many of the patterns and scenarios that our clients are bringing reflect to varying degrees things they probably wrestle with most of their life. Most of the things you're doing with an executive is not surprising to them. They've been told that before. They've realized it about themselves. So all I can do in the short span I have them as my client in coaching is, where are they on that journey and what might be useful to them next? And so, for example, because one of the things that leaders discovered, much often to their horror, is that as they move up the ranks of the organization, people stop talking to them. And so often executives are the least informed people in their own companies, unless they make an overt effort to change that. And so spiritual maturity, even if they might not resonate with that word, becomes essential to them. What are you not seeing because people are not telling you? Or they're warping it to suit their own purposes, or to steer with all kinds of all that. And so if somebody has like a huge blind spot, and through the course of coaching them, they go, oh my God, I never realized I never even saw any of that. So you don't want to go to an action plan that sort of disrupts the sensitivity of that discovery and say, great, how about if for the next week, you just start to notice that in your life? And then come back and give me some examples. And then let's take one of those examples that's meaningful to you. Now we'll scaffold that up into what would you do about that? So for me, it's just become a much more nuanced, and I find poignant, but also focused way to coach. And I find it, for me, it's much more realistic about the capacities our clients have, which now at this point in human history is actually far more diminished than we might think. And I'm finding that these ways of working just seem more fitting for the time we live in, to me. Okay, so I have just a couple more slides, I think, and then it's one of the disadvantages of traveling on the road. I didn't want to lug paper around, so here we are. So we'll see. These will be a surprise for all of us. Okay, so this is, again, part of what I was sharing, that in many ways, many of us are having to increasingly spend energy to cope and even to stay connected. And it doesn't leave a lot of discretionary energy to the things we really aspire to in our life. Part of why I don't set goals for most executives is that they already have way too many of them. And they're often spending a lot of time just putting out fires. So part of the value of the maturities is to actually equip people to be more discerning and choiceful. And so they can actually start to really honestly assess, how do I spend my time and energy, and how could I change that to free up more time and energy to do the things that matter the most to me? And so all the emphasis we're seeing now on mental health, on well-being, a lot of it for me, frankly, feels like it's just helping people cope, which is fine at a certain point, but there's a whole bunch of other things, I think, that need to be put in place. But first, we have to value them. And so part of the purpose of the 5 maturities is to get us to focus on different things than we might have in the past. So I'm going to skip that for a minute, because we're going to cover that a lot in the second session coming up. So I've actually created a whole bunch of more slides on that. So I'll say that for next time. But going back to, I think, the very first person that checked in. So part of where this came from was, again, recognizing, how do we equip clients to take what they've gained from a coaching session and use that on their own when they're outside of the coaching session. And if you look at the research from habit formation and habit change, one of the things that seems pretty consistent around my experience and pretty much all the literature I've read is it's actually more productive for us to focus on the cue for the new behavior rather than the new habit itself. It's too much to remember. We need triggers, activators for the reminders of the new habit. So I started thinking about, like, what are we ultimately teaching in narrative coaching and integrative development? It's about noticing the field and the characters in the field and the energies of the field and what's not being said in the field. And so all of that became, I realized, was in many ways enabling us to be much more discerning and attentive, as if we're almost like trackers, like indigenous trackers and others, where we're actually helping our clients not try to remember what we said or our models or our frames or even what we talked about in sessions, but what can they notice about their environment that they may not have noticed before that would help them and remind them of what they learned in coaching or gained from coaching. And so rather than having one goal that they're working on, they're having one maybe point of attention that they, or one practice that they can use 24/7. So they have many, many cues to practice the behavior or the approach that they're working on. So the way I summarize this was basically helping us all realize this moment is your curriculum. They're not going to, they've not been trained, most of them, in the things we've been trained on as coaches. They're not going to remember most of that anyways. And so, like, I'll give you an example. So I was working with a significant new executive at a large tech company, happened to be the son of the founder, and was under enormous pressure and wasn't handling the pressure particularly well. And so was in clear danger of derailing, which would be a disaster for him, wouldn't do well for the CEO, and would be, he had huge revenue expectations put on him. And so we're trying to figure out, like, where do we begin in this? And so there was just massive complexities at work, and there just was too much that was daunting and too much at risk there. And so I just inquired into his home life, and I learned that he had two young children, and he cared for them very deeply. He cared for his wife deeply, and he also recognized he probably wasn't serving any of them very well, given his demands at work. And so I asked him about, like, what he does when he gets home, and he said, "Well, I do my best to dedicate 10 minutes to my two young girls, to be with them and attend to them and have more family time around dinner." But this whole notion of his face lit up when he talked about the two girls greeting him at the door. And so we created this whole session that was nothing about reliving what that was like for him, having him tell me what he would tell them. And then we had this exploration around, if that's indeed his curriculum, what can you learn from that that might help you when you come to work? And he has this huge epiphany. And he goes, "I see them as two completely different worlds." I said, when I see you and hear you tell about your life at home, that's the person they need for you. That's the part of you that's missing at work. So what can you do when you come to work that would replicate the experience of meeting your kids when you come home? And he said, "Oh, I have a really funny secretary and I really like her, but I give her crap all the time because I'm too busy to actually talk to her. So I could create a little ritual for myself that I actually say hello to her. I might even bring her a coffee or some flowers or just even ask her about her day." And so that became this sort of go-to ritual for him. And then we had a huge meeting set up to mend fences with a really pivotal team in the business that he completely burned. And so we basically created some experiences and experiments for him about how he wanted to set up that meeting. And so all of this, the whole curriculum for this was not from me, not from any theory about anything. It was really about who he became in meeting his young children. And everything we needed for him to get started on this new journey came through reminders, through cues, through memories of being with them. And so even things like the way he set up the meeting room, where he had this, even the way he overprivileged the leader of this other team to rebalance the scales. The way they started the conversation around getting to know each other rather than diving into the conflict. So all that grew out of his own curriculum, his own experience. And so what we're trying to do in this work is to begin to ask ourselves, where are we being asked to mature ourselves so we can allow ourselves to move away from some of the things we feel obliged to carry or do, so we can be with our clients more in that way. So you'll see this in the report, which you can download from the website, and we will cover this in more detail when we meet up next time. But this is a way for you to begin to get a sense of, in this particular client or this particular coaching session, where did I feel strong? What did I miss where I might want to pay some attention to my own development? I think that's the last one. Oh, yes, this is the last one. So I'll let you read this because this was the ultimate inspiration for creating the 5 maturities. Then I'll give us about 6 or 7 minutes for some final questions. So Freud often gets a bad name now, but he was actually quite a visionary at the time. It doesn't seem that way now from our perspective, but back then he was, in a way. And he very much wanted to keep this notion of psychoanalysis, which is what he invented, away from the physicians, even though he was one, because he realized it wasn't a medical thing. But he also wanted to keep it away from the church and the priests. And I love this phrase, a profession of secular ministers of souls. So I finally realized in the end, that's what this work is ultimately about. And so in that, we're trying to find a way to what's coming after coaching. And I sort of hinted at that earlier in the call, and we're going to dive into that discussion in much more detail in the second and third sessions. But what I'm noticing is more and more practitioners are getting frustrated with coaching because it traps them in a too narrow of a box. And so we're going to begin to experiment with not only how this work enrich coaching, but actually give some shape to those of us who are moving beyond coaching to something that's more akin to what Freud was after with his vision. Okay, so that's a lot, I know. I'm going to stop now and see in our last 5 or 6 minutes what is coming up for you that you might want to ask about or share.
David, this is just a structural question
Sure.
regarding the future meetups on the 5 maturities. What time and days will it be?
So they're already scheduled. So you should have gotten emails with the original dates. And I assume that Steve had sent out what I asked him to, which was the dates and times for this second session that appeals to this time zone. Did anyone receive those ones like you got here tonight, so you must have gotten something. So
Yeah.
I used the one from before.
Yeah, it's all the same link.
But I got no email about it.
Okay.
You can go on your website and it
went.
lists everything.
But thank you, Miriam. So I will send Steve a note tonight and make sure that gets sent out to all the people that were interested in this. So you have the link, the date, the time, everything you need right there in the email. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
David, what are you seeing? And I've heard you make some comments about this along the way in many different sessions that I've attended. What do you see as happening or emerging in the world now, and maybe looking a little bit out in the future, that we as coaches need to be able to evolve what we're doing as a profession to be that secular minister of souls?
So one of the many sort of sociological frames I would bring I'm realizing they're complicated issues, but so we live, I believe we live in a time in which the institutions which built for example, the Western world over the last 50, 60, 80 years are now to varying degrees broken or not effective. Healthcare, education, governance, they're just way too complicated now. And what we have isn't really sufficient for the challenges that we're facing. So so in that, if you accept that as true to whatever degree you believe that is true, that assessment is true, I observe two things happening. Part of the population wants to, in my view, regress to the imagination of a much simpler time, a much more uniform time that looks like them. But that's it's not, I find that really frightening and not helpful at all. And I can totally appreciate the human need that drives that. It's their attempt to try to make some sense out of the chaos. In part, there's a whole bunch of other factors, but let's just stay within that frame. And to exclude things that are inconvenient or difficult or more complex. So I think part of our role is to help our clients hold spaces for ambiguity, to deal with all the challenges in their own life that way. And then my energy is around, I believe we're moving to a space in which everybody's going to become an integrative practitioner of some form. And when I was at Institute of Coaching at their Harvard conference, I had a lot of surgeons and doctors in my session on the 5 maturities. And they said, we weren't taught any of these things in medical school. And I explained to them why I chose the surgeon I did to replace my shoulder. It had nothing to do with competency. That was an assumption I made, that they're all pretty much the same. And the things I was describing that were valuable to me, they said, again, we weren't taught any of those things in medical school, and we're not rewarded for them. We're not paid for them. Our systems no longer support them, but they mattered most to you. And that I suspect they matter most to most of our patients. And so I feel like, again, like I started with, no profession in any discipline anywhere in the world is sufficient in itself anymore. Teachers spend more time now managing standardized tests and being social workers than they often get to spend time actually teaching. People in medicine spend more time managing electronic records and pharmaceutical representatives than they do actually attending to our well-being. And so it's very frustrating for all these practitioners, because that's not why they went into medicine or teaching or nursing or whatever it is they're doing. And so I imagine that while this is all starting in coaching, I'm hoping that lots of people will take this work forward and begin to bring this to other disciplines, into communities where we're faced with a lot of very difficult conversations we're not having very well. And so this is at least one frame and one piece of that puzzle to try to make that better.
Okay.
All right. So I've got thank you, Mila. It's my lifelong quest. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I've got a bunch of narrative coaches waiting for me. So I'm going to drop off this call, take a deep breath, and offer my gratitude to you, Emilia, again for that. And I hope you'll join us for the second and third round of the discussions. And in a couple of months, we'll start some programs and retreats to dive into this work in much, much more detail for you.
Thanks,
Okay?
David.
All right. Be well, my friends. Until
Bye-bye.
next time.